Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss election results in France, the new GOP platform, and Donald Trump challenging Joe Biden to a golf match. I'm joined by Geoff Shullenberger and Sohrab Ahmari, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. On Compact this week, Nathan Pinkoski looked back at France's election results in his article, How Macron Lost France. There's a great deal of concern, not just in France, but across the West over the fate of democracy. In his article, Pinkoski argues that there's been a longer process undermining democracy in France as elsewhere in the West, and it's really an internal process rather than an external threat. It's a process where the democratic myth substitutes for and in certain ways undermines the actual functioning of democratic electoral processes, liberal political rights, and the like. Geoff, Sohrab, what did you take away from the election results?
They seem quite ambiguous and subject to many different readings. And that was, I suppose, part of what was interesting about them. Obviously you saw the scenes of the left celebrating in the streets, and you saw the sort of global response often being one of kind of triumph and relief over the seeming defeat of the forces of reaction and quasi-fascism. And then on the other hand, you saw people remarking that, in fact, the Rassemblement National, the right populist party of Marine Le Pen, did actually win a sort of plurality of the vote, but because of the vagaries of how the votes are counted, that did not add up to a dominant position within the parliament. And so, it seemed like a result that could be read in any number of ways. Pinkoski in our pages sort of concludes that, in fact, it did consolidate the seeming rise of the Rassemblement National, despite the result not being what was expected after the European parliamentary elections, which we discussed a few weeks ago, where the surge of Le Pen's party and allies seemed to herald a massive sort of right populist wave, which then prompted Macron, to the befuddlement of many, to call the elections, despite the fact that he seemed to be quite poorly positioned. And there's all kinds of theories about what his thinking was there. One is that he actually hoped to force the RN into the position of governing, because in general, as I understand it, the position of prime minister in France, which is relatively unusual in having both a president and a prime minister, is often a sort of weak and embattled one, and so it's kind of the job that nobody wants. And so if you saddle someone like Jordan Bardella, the sort of young and charismatic rising leader of the RN in this position of prime minister, it'll kind of weaken his allure and force him into the position of governing from a relatively weak position, and that this will set up Macron and his allies to ultimately defeat these rising right populist forces in the next presidential election, which will happen in 2027. And so, that's kind of one reading I've encountered of what Macron's larger strategy was. There are others, but so it's unclear. I think it was taken as, I think broadly as not a great result for Macron, so far as it seemed to elevate the forces of the French left. Although on the other hand, this is a French left that was essentially allowed to through the kind of the electoral strategy that was devised between the left and the center. Basically they didn't compete in places where they would weaken each other, and thereby were able to kind of present a united front against the right. And so, as I understand it, basically, this is a left that is willing to be co-opted by the sort of neoliberal center embodied by Macron. And so it's not a particularly not a left that presents a particularly strong challenge ultimately to the status quo. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting result, in part because it doesn't necessarily point in any clear direction, um, and could be seen as continuing to herald, as I think Pinkoski reads it, a sort of uh, a future in which Le Pen is actually able to finally win the presidency, which has for decades the forces of the right have been excluded from power through these kinds of broad Republican fronts. Um, Going back to when Jean-Marie Le Pen made it into the final round of the election in 2002, only to be crushingly defeated by Jacques Chirac in a sort of all hands on deck, sort of popular front effort. I believe Chirac won something like 80% of the vote. So, but what was notable there was that Le Pen, essentially crushed the socialist, and received more votes than the socialist candidate in the first round. And so, the Le Pens have been sort of biting at the heels of the French establishment for some decades. Repeatedly, you've seen this phenomenon where the whole array of mainstream parties from center right to far left will come together to exclude uh, Le Pen, whether Marine or Jean-Marie, and then ultimately you'll end up with this kind of this kind of unworkable coalition that certainly doesn't redound to the benefit of the French left, and is generally kind of redounded to the benefit of the sort of neoliberal center right, as the dominant force in French politics for several decades. But in any case, I think it's interesting in part because it can be read in so many different ways.
So, along with elections in France, there were elections in the UK, uh, in which the Tory party was crushingly defeated by Labour, and we also saw some gains for the Reform Party led by Nigel Farage. Sohrab, does this result mirror the results in France in some way? And do these European elections suggest anything for the coming vote in the US? The contest between Donald Trump and whoever the Democrats run.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and a difficult question because systems are so different in some ways. Political cultures are different. But it's interesting, in all three of the areas that you mentioned, there is a kind of ferment, in some cases coming from the right and in some cases coming from the left, about the fact that these results don't reflect proportionality in terms of votes. In other words, that the vote proportions don't translate into seat proportions for the various parties involved in Britain and France. And then, of course, in the US, it's more complicated. The fact that Joe Biden, overwhelmingly won the Democratic primary for 2024, and yet he is under pressure to step aside because of his obvious slide into senescence. And we have a very, very astute piece by the political scientist and Compact columnist Daryl Paul at compactmag.com. The headline is "The Perils of Actually Existing Democracy." He tries to kind of pour cold water on this idea that, frankly, that votes should necessarily strictly result in a proportionate number of seats or a proportionate amount of power. The larger essay, I mean, it's an essay, so I can't sum up easily in kind of the span of a podcast, but I'll read you the upshot, which I think is worthwhile. He says, such fears are misplaced, right? In France, it's the right that's angry. In Britain, also, it's actually the right that's angry because, the gains that reform made relative to its the number of ballots that it garnered are so skewed relative to, for example, the huge gains that Labour made relative to the number of ballots that it garnered. But Daryl says, quote, such fears are misplaced. Representation has never been the sole purpose of elections, and it is often not even the primary one. Democracy is not a form of rule, but a form of legitimation. At the nation-state scale, the people cannot rule and never will. A more realistic understanding of actually existing democracy can lower the temperature of our discourse, calm our doomsayers, and perhaps enable a more constructive debate on what we want from the democracy. So I would just recommend everyone read that piece at compactmag.com by my friend Daryl, our friend Daryl. And in terms of whether we're headed for something similar in the United States, I think we're headed for something similar often in the United States by default, because of the Electoral College. We often have results where the popular vote does not translate into it does not translate into the outcome that's actually ultimately recognized as the winner of the presidential election. And I think Daryl's point goes to this as well, right? It's that the point is that the election is legitimate. It doesn't mean that it's perfectly representative in the way that partisans on either side would wish it to be. On the substantive side of your question, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, it was predicted that Britain would buck the trend of continental Europe. Much of continental Europe is drifting in a rightward direction, but Britain was expected to go Labour. So that's predictable. But as I said, much of continental Europe was expected to drift rightward, and yet the ultimate outcome of this French election was such a disappointment for the National Front, as I refuse to call it anything else because French parties just change their names too often. So I'm just going to keep to the old National Front name because it is the same party. And yeah, I mean, so that didn't go that way because of tactical voting, right? In districts where the New Popular Front, Mélenchon's group, was coming in third, Mélenchon instructed his voters. He basically pulled out of those districts, instructed his voters to support the Macronites because he wouldn't want the fascist National Front to take over, and that's his reasoning. So I mean, that's not anti-democratic. Tactical voting is a practice in parliamentary systems of this kind. First past the post, and it is what it is. But in terms of like the larger drift to the right that is supposedly happening in continental Europe and is expected to happen in the United States, I think that goes on for the reasons that our other columnist, Nathan Penkoski, lays out, and which Geoff and you yourself, Matthew, alluded to in your answer, which is that notwithstanding the effects of this tactical voting, the overall drift of French politics is to the right and to the right of its political class. So that's, unless some dynamic changes, and there's nothing foreseeable that would spell such a change, that trend will continue. And at some point, the line of total votes will catch up with the line of representation, and you'll see a right-wing governed France.
In other news, the GOP has brought out a new platform. It significantly softens language on abortion. It also removes reference to traditional marriage as being between a man and a woman, and it softens language in the LGBT platform on the national debt. It highlights other priorities that are particular to Trump's GOP, including immigration restriction and tariffs. Sohrab, I know you've been following this closely. Is the new GOP platform a disaster for the right and a betrayal of conservative priorities? Is it something more promising or mixed?
Well, there's two elements on this. One is the full platform itself and what it says about the Trumpian GOP going into the 2024 elections. And then there's the specific issue of pro-life, which has been the cause of some back and forth between yours truly and some of my friends on the pro-life cause, and I can address either one. But overall, I think it's a pretty good platform, and I described it on Twitter as an instance of popularism. It's a kind of it's an idea that arises out of Italian Christian democracy. The idea being that parties should try to kind of cater to what the middle of the country wants and reflect that. And so populism and popularism can often go hand in hand, but you can be popularist without being populist. There's an element of combative, sort of anti-establishment energy involved in populism that popularism needn't have. And I see this platform as a popularist platform in so many respects. Okay, immigration, voters tell pollsters, is the number one issue on their minds. They've told this repeatedly. It didn't used to be the case. A few years ago, when you polled immigration, it was like in the bottom 10, toward the bottom 10. Now it's number one. And so this gets at what voters want. They want less immigration. They want the border closed. A majority of Hispanics favor immediate deportation of people who are here, or close to a majority. A third of Hispanics prefer a wall. I say this just to show how widespread the sentiment is. So it addresses that. A lot of people don't want World War III. They don't want confrontation with Russia, which is a nuclear state. And that this platform reflects that and says we're going to prevent World War III. It's interesting how often the language in the platform is focused on peace or non-war. This really is a new thing. If you had asked me 5-10 years ago, if you had told me that the Republican National Committee would put out a document whose main kind of national security elements are anchored in stopping World War III or bringing peace to the Middle East and Europe, which is the language that the platform now uses, I would have laughed at your face. I mean, this is a new thing, and I think a welcome thing. And this is thanks to Trump. He's made that the norm. It's Republicans that you're used to being the party that kind of wants to drive us toward World War III. I'm slightly exaggerating, but so this is such an enormous shift. It says we're not going to touch entitlements. There's going to be no cuts to Social Security and Medicare. So that's what the majority of people want. As we've said on this podcast like 700 times, the share of the population that wants means tested entitlements or wants to cut Social Security, privatize Medicare, and so on, is a very narrow sliver of like libertarians in Washington. They're all clustered at the Cato Institute and the American Enterprise Institute. No one else wants that. So it's good that the Republican platform just says we're going to preserve that. Of course, now there have to be fiscal steps to make sure that happens, but the point is that that's a positive development. So overall, I would describe it as a popularist document. In fact, I might write a piece for us. Don't hold me accountable, dear listener, not for my compactmag.substack.com, but for the main magazine, calling it just that, the Trumpian popularism. And then on this abortion point, let me just point people to our Substack on that, because I wrote an extensive piece and I don't want to hog the mic here. But if you go to compactmag.substack.com, I have a new piece up called Yes to the Populist Compromise on Abortion. And it has to do with, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, both of whom, as you know, are kind of top contenders to be Trump's vice presidential pick. They both took to the Sunday shows and defended the nature of the platform, which kind of represents a retrenchment from abortion. It only says we're going to fight late-term abortions. Otherwise, basically, the implicit point is we've given you Dobbs, now it's a state-by-state fight. And so I defended that on Twitter, and lots of my pro-life friends, and not a few of my critics on the right, of course, took issue with that, basically calling JD a sellout, and kind of by extension calling me a sellout. And so I won't get into it. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you'll go to compactmag.substack.com to check out that piece. The headline is "Yes to the Populist Compromise on Abortion."
I think popularism is a really great way of understanding the way Trump has transformed the GOP. He really is competing for the center of the country. The revision in the platform is, I think, a vindication for an argument that people on this podcast have made in various forms. Sohrab and I wrote an article titled "He's Still the One," arguing for Trump in the GOP primary that was published at compactmag.com in September 2022. I argued more recently in the New York Times that in an article titled "The Secret of Trump's Appeal Isn't Authoritarianism." Really, the argument was just something we've often observed in this podcast. Trump's appeal is in many ways a moderate appeal. Not in every way, certainly, but in terms of his policy platform, a lot of it looks like the Democratic Party of the 1990s, something like that. And I think the restructuring of the GOP platform is another complication for those who have invested a lot of time and energy in painting Trump as an extremist or someone who lies far outside the American political tradition.
I would just repeat the point that I think the most striking notes in the platform are the one about it says fight for and protect Social Security and Medicare with no cuts, including no changes to the retirement age. So this is really a direct reversal of the sort of Paul Ryan program that Ryan attempted to push through in Congress, through these attempts at a grand bargain with Obama, right? They and did actually succeed in getting the Obama administration to agree in principle to things like potentially raising the retirement age or adjusting changing the means by which Social Security is pegged to inflation. And so, this is definitely a repudiation of the GOP's longstanding program on entitlements. Now, it's interesting to me insofar as it's also clear to me that there are many in the congressional GOP who, as far as I know, do still definitely want to cut entitlements. So I'm sort of interested in the internal party politics here. And then the same goes for the sort of peacenik aspect of this, where it seems that this is an attempt to outflank the Democrats and the Biden administration on wanting to prevent further escalation with Russia, and perhaps, without saying so, perhaps in the Middle East as well, and to kind of push back against the sort of brinksmanship that we've seen the U.S. and NATO undertaking. And so what's striking to me here again is that clearly you still have, unhinged lunatics like Lindsey Graham in Congress who are, if anything, don't think that the Biden administration is going nearly far enough towards provoking confrontations with various enemies. And so, it is interesting to me just, clearly we have this presidential agenda, which is reflected in this document. And then we do have quite a few people in the GOP congressional caucus who I think would be at odds with some of these positions. So then the other thing I'd observe here that's just to slightly throw cold water on the immigration point, which is, this is foregrounded. It's the first two items are sealing the border and carrying out the largest deportation operation. I will note, and harking back to something we published by Mark Krikorian some time ago, there is no mention here of E-Verify. And I do think that is a striking omission because that's probably the most efficient and immediate way um, to increase enforcement in a way that will directly change the situation on the ground. And the reality is that you can make these pronouncements about deportation, but given the immense logistical difficulties of that effort, a certain amount of this policy would have to be enacted through attrition. In other words, through simply making it harder um, to come here and be able to work. And so, thus stemming the tide in part, not by building a wall, but by simply making it less economically viable, and also by making it less economically viable for people to remain here, and thus giving them more of a motive to return. It's worth noting that it used to be the case that Mexico sent the vast majority of immigrants to the U.S. That is no longer even close to the case. Part of the reason for that is changing economic conditions on the ground in Mexico is simply more viable for people to return home and have jobs and keep their lives there rather than come here. And so that's just an example of how economic incentives do really shift patterns, and they're not as glamorous or as sort of good red meat for the campaign trail, but it simply is the reality that that's part of what's driving all of this. And so if the platform isn't foregrounding attempts to regulate the labor market, then that makes me wonder how serious it actually is, especially because, of course, E-Verify has often not been passed precisely because the business lobby opposes it, whereas the business lobby is happy with hearing people talk about walls and deportation efforts, but that they have a much stronger objection when it's going to eat directly into their ability to continue hiring cheap labor. So it does make me slightly cynical about the emphasis given to that, just given the previous track record on all of that. So, in any case, definitely an interesting document.
The most heated and informative element of the recent presidential debate was the tussle between Biden and Trump over their golf games. Biden insisted to a golfer. Trump denied it, said Biden couldn't hit it 50 yards. And now Trump has upped the ante. At a recent rally, he challenged Biden to a golf match. I'm officially challenging Crooked Joe to an 18-hole golf match right here on Doral Blue Monster, considered one of the greatest tournament golf courses anywhere in the world, Trump said. It will be among the most watched sporting events in history. Trump proposed setting aside $1 million, and donating it to a charity of Biden's choice if Biden won, or Biden donating $1 million to a charity of Trump's choice if Trump won. And I think we need this. It's a good way to settle the debate. I mean, I think to settle the race. Presidential debates are televised debates are relatively recent. That it's not a constant feature of presidential politics. These things rise and fall. So why not the golf match? What do you say, guys?
Yep, I'm coming out as strongly in favor of this. I think it would really make this year special, and I hope that it happens. I mean, a friend of mine after the debate a few weeks ago said something along the lines of, hear me out, Trump Biden unity ticket with reality TV golf tour reality TV tie-in, which I was immediately persuaded of this being a great idea, and hope hoping against hope that these things will actually come to pass.
I'm just gulping like a cartoon character in like Tom and Jerry when you're afraid of something, because I mean, in the sense that I'm so glad I'm not up for public office in any way, shape, or form in this day and age where my golf skills have to be judged.
The John Birch Society advanced the thesis that Dwight Eisenhower was some kind of subversive communist agent. And Russell Kirk, the conservative intellectual, observed in response to this contention that Eisenhower isn't a communist, he's a golfer. And I thought of Kirk's observation about Eisenhower when I saw this challenge from Trump, which I think is another reminder, tying back to our earlier discussion, that Trump probably isn't someone who's seeking to overturn the American political system. Biden is not a radical communist agent. They're two aging golfers, and their virtues and vices, I think, are pretty closely tied to that of our political system. So with that, thanks, Sohrab, thanks, Geoff, and thanks to you, listeners.